I was unwrapping wedding china in my new kitchen when a stranger's voice on the phone told me something no wife should ever have to hear about her husband. "I saw them together," he said. "Your husband and his mother. Don't tell him. Come alone." I stood there holding a teacup, staring through the doorway at the two people I trusted most in the world, laughing softly in my living room. And in that instant, I understood the life I thought I was building might already be gone. My name is Emily Carter. 7 days earlier, my husband Ryan and I had closed on the house of our dreams. A two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden bed I'd already mapped out for tomatoes and hydrangeas. I'd put down most of the money myself, an inheritance from my father, a man who spent 30 years teaching high school chemistry and never once complained about the modest life it gave him. He left me enough to make this house possible. When I signed the closing papers, I remember thinking he would have been proud. I remember thinking that finally, at 40 years old, I had built something permanent. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, boxes still lining the hallway, the smell of fresh paint hanging in the air. I didn't recognize the number and almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Mrs. Carter, this is Walter Hines. I sold you the house." I remembered him instantly, a soft-spoken man in his 70s, a retired electrical engineer with kind eyes and a slight tremor in his hands. He'd lived in that house for 31 years with his late wife, and when he handed over the keys, he told me he hoped it would treat me as well as it had treated them. "Is everything all right, Mr. Hines?" A pause stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I need to apologize for something," he finally said. "When we set up the smart home system years ago, we installed a security camera in the living room. I disconnected most of them before the sale, but I missed one. It's still linked to my cloud account. I only noticed because I got a storage notification a few days ago, and I went to delete the footage and He stopped again. "Mrs. Carter, I think you need to see this yourself." My stomach tightened. "See what?" "I'd rather not say over the phone. I saved everything to a drive. Please come see me, alone. Don't say anything to your husband yet." His voice dropped, careful, almost protective. "Please. Come alone." I told him I would, and hung up before I could ask anything else, because my hands had started shaking and I didn't want him to hear it in my voice. I set the phone down and looked into the living room, where Ryan stood on a step stool, hanging a framed photo of his parents' wedding day. His mother Margaret directing him, with the calm authority of a woman who had never once doubted her own judgment. "A little to the left," she said, and Ryan adjusted without complaint, the way he always did with her. They were laughing about something I hadn't caught. I watched their faces, searching for some crack, some sign of whatever Walter Hines thought I needed to see. There was nothing. Ryan turned and caught my eye, smiling the same easy smile that had made me fall for him 12 years ago. Back when I was still grieving my father, and he'd shown up at exactly the right moments with exactly the right words. "You look pale," he said. "Fine," I said. "Just tired. I'm going to run out. We're low on paint for the guest room." It was a lie, smooth and immediate, and it frightened me how easily it came. Margaret glanced at me, her eyes lingering half a second too long, the way they sometimes did, as if she were quietly measuring me against a standard I'd never meet. "Take your time, dear. We'll finish up here." I grabbed my keys and sat behind the wheel a full minute before I could turn the key. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, maybe furniture moving, curtain measuring. But some part of me already knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually turns. The small hesitations, the way Ryan answered certain questions, the way Margaret insisted on being at the final walkthrough. The way both of them had grown a little too comfortable, a little too fast, in a house my father's money had built. I didn't know yet that I was driving toward the moment that would end my marriage. I only knew I needed to see it with my own eyes. Walter's rental was small and tidy on the other side of town. He opened the door before I even knocked, as if he'd been watching for my car, and his face told me this wasn't going to be the misunderstanding I'd hoped for. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." He led me to a kitchen table where a laptop sat open, dark, waiting. "I built that camera system myself, mostly for my wife's peace of mind when I traveled," he said, lowering himself carefully into the chair across from me. "When we sold, I disconnected everything I could remember. I missed one behind the bookshelf, wired into an outlet I'd forgotten existed. I found out it was still active when my cloud storage said it was full. I went to delete the footage. Then I watched it. I couldn't delete it without showing you first." "Show me." He turned the laptop and pressed play. The footage was time-stamped 4 days earlier, a Friday I'd spent late at the office. The angle looked down over my half-furnished living room. I watched Ryan let himself in, Margaret following, glancing around the room the way a person looks at something they're already picturing as their own. "She still thinks this house belongs to both of you," Margaret said on the recording, settling onto the arm of the sofa. "Sweet girl. She never even reads the fine print." Ryan laughed that same familiar laugh and said, "She trusts me. Why would she read the fine print?" "I'm her husband. That trust is useful," Margaret said, "as long as we use it correctly." Something cold settled into my chest. They kept talking, a refinance package, a broker Margaret knew personally, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Ryan mentioned that my father's inheritance had covered nearly 70% of the down payment. And Margaret said it was a shame money like that hadn't gone through proper family channels. They discussed a power of attorney clause buried in the paperwork that would let ownership shift. Gradually, quietly, legally, no dramatic confrontation required. Margaret kept saying over time, savoring the words like a recipe that needed patience. "She won't notice," Ryan said. "She never notices these things. She trusts me with all of it." I sat frozen, watching my husband describe my blind trust as a resource to be managed. The man who'd held my hand at my father's funeral and the man on that screen were somehow the same person. The footage ran another 6 minutes, Margaret walking my kitchen, commenting the layout would suit proper entertaining, once a few walls came down. Ryan nodding along the way, he always agreed with her. I'd once found that loyalty endearing. Now I understood it was something else, alliance. When it ended, Walter closed the laptop gently, like closing it too fast might hurt me further, and slid a small USB drive across the table. I copied everything, every angle, every date. "I don't know what's going on in your marriage, and it isn't my place to guess, but a house holds people accountable to nothing except what's documented. I thought you should have this before anyone decides to erase what actually happened inside those walls." I picked up the drive, barely the weight of a house key. And yet it felt like it might tip the entire foundation of my life. Walking me to the door, he added quietly, "You still have time, Mrs. Carter. Whatever you decide, you still have time to do it right." I drove home with the drive in my coat pocket, my hand resting over it at every red light. And somewhere on that quiet drive, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them yet. Not until I understood exactly how deep this went, and exactly how to make sure it could never happen again. I walked back into my house that evening and became someone else. Not a different woman, just quieter. "How was the paint store?" Ryan asked, not looking up from a box of utensils. "Busy," I said. "I'll go back tomorrow." He nodded, satisfied, and that was the end of it. Watching him arrange forks into the drawer organizer I'd bought weeks earlier, I felt something strange settle over me. Not rage yet. Cold clarity, like stepping outside on the first frost and finally seeing your own breath. But what happened over the following days completely changed how I saw everything I'd once taken for granted. For the first time in 12 years, I started watching my husband the way you watch a stranger. Ryan handled every piece of mail with practiced efficiency, calling it easier this way whenever I offered to help. Margaret, who now visited almost daily under the guise of helping us settle in, always collected the mail before I got home. Their conversations shifted the moment I entered a room, not stopping, just softening, rerouting, like water finding a path around a rock. None of it meant anything alone. Together, it meant everything. 3 days after my visit to Walter's, Ryan came home with a folder and laid it on the table with the easy manner of a man discussing weekend plans. "Refinance paperwork," he said. "Just cleaning up loan terms now that we've closed. Routine." Margaret, who happened to be there, she always happened to be there, patted my hand. "Everyone does this after closing, dear. Boring, but it's just paperwork." "Of course," I said, smiling. "Let me look it over when I have a quiet evening. I like to actually read things before I sign." Ryan's jaw tightened, so briefly I might have imagined it. "No rush," he said, but there was a rush. I could feel it. Over the following evenings, I asked innocent questions. What does this clause mean? Why is this section highlighted? And Ryan answered smoothly, relieved I wasn't pushing harder. He began to relax, to believe his mother had been right about me all along. Too trusting, too soft, too in love to ever really look. What he didn't know was that every night after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a soft blue light, going through every page line by line. I photographed each document before returning the folder exactly where he'd left it. I opened an anonymous email account and began forwarding copies, screenshots, and dates. I kept a small voice recorder in my cardigan pocket during family dinners, replaying conversations later in my car during lunch breaks, parked blocks from my office where no one would see me. I built a shadow archive, invisible to them, growing heavier every day. On the fifth night, I found the clause that changed everything. Buried on page 14, in language dense enough to be skipped over, was a provision granting Ryan limited power of attorney over the property, to be enacted upon my notarized signature. Framed as a convenience, something to streamline paperwork, I read it 3 times. It wasn't a refinance. It was a refinance wrapped around something else entirely. A legal key that once turned would let Ryan make decisions about my house, my father's money, my future, without ever asking me again. I sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the house settle, thinking about my father, the quiet way he'd saved money over 30 years of teaching kids who mostly didn't care. And the thing he used to tell me, the surest way to lose something valuable isn't theft. It's trust handed to the wrong person without ever checking where it landed. I closed the laptop and let myself smile grimly in the dark. They thought I was signing away my future. I was about to make sure I never lost it at all. I found attorney Daniel across the way. Most people find lawyers when they're afraid to ask anyone they know. A late-night search on my phone, brightness turned all the way down. 26 years of practice. Reviews that used words like discreet and thorough. I called from a grocery store parking lot the next morning, heart pounding like I was doing something shameful instead of necessary. His office sat above a dry cleaner's on a quiet street, small and unglamorous, and I liked him immediately for exactly that reason. He was maybe 58, gray at the temples, unhurried, like a man who'd heard every version of my story and stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. I brought everything, the drive, my photographs, the emails, the recordings organized by date. He watched the footage in silence, occasionally writing on a legal pad in handwriting too small to read upside down. When it ended, he sat back and looked at me. "Mrs. Carter, I want to be direct because I think you'd prefer that to gentleness right now. Please. This isn't a routine refinance. That power of attorney clause, if signed and notarized, would give your husband broad authority over the property. Not immediate total control, but enough scaffolding that, over time, with a few more carefully worded documents, he could transfer ownership, borrow against the equity, or sell it, all without your active participation. It's built to look harmless, built to be signed by someone who trusts the person handing it over and doesn't read past the first paragraph. So it's legal. On its face, yes. That's what makes it dangerous. There's nothing illegal about a spouse asking another spouse to sign paperwork. The law assumes if you signed it, you understood it. Which means your only real protection is not signing it and making sure they can't quietly force the issue another way. Can they? Not if we move quickly. He tapped his pen. I can file protective measures today. Notice of interest, updated deed language. A formal record establishing you as the sole party with authority to approve any transfer. It won't stop them from asking you to sign. But even if you did sign under pressure, any transfer would require your verified appearance and separate legal review before finalizing. In plain terms, I'm building a wall around the house that only you can open. Relief moved through me, dizzying. But underneath it sat something harder, something that had been growing since I first read that clause. I want more than a wall, Mr. Cross. I want them to understand exactly what they tried to do. I want it documented, undeniable. Something shifted in his expression, quiet respect. Then we do this carefully. Continue exactly as you have been. Don't refuse to sign, don't confront them. Let them believe they're close to finishing what they started. The more comfortable they become, the more they'll say, and the stronger your position gets. Meanwhile, I file everything so nothing transfers without going through me first. I left rehearsing the version of myself I needed to keep performing, the grateful, trusting wife slowly coming around to signing away a life, already legally armored against them. It worked better than I expected. Within 2 days, Ryan's tension dissolved into comfort. He mentioned offhand that once things were settled, he'd finally get quotes for a basement home office. Margaret started arriving with paint swatches and furniture catalogs, holding them against my walls like a woman decorating a house she already owned. I watched them build their comfort one relaxed conversation at a time, and said nothing to disturb it. On a Thursday evening, Margaret mentioned casually that she knew a notary who could come by the house directly. So much easier than driving somewhere, dear. I let a beat of hesitation pass, then smiled. Monday, let's do Monday. I'll have the weekend to feel settled about it. Margaret's face lit with something close to triumph. Ryan squeezed my hand, and I let him, smiling back with an ease that would have terrified me a week earlier, because I understood now that I was no longer the woman standing in his way. I was the woman closing the trap around it. If I had known just how far they'd go in those final days before the signing, I might have moved even faster than I did. The days between Thursday and Monday stretched thin with tension only I seemed to feel. Ryan hummed making coffee. Margaret arrived nearly every afternoon, tape measure in hand, murmuring about where a sectional might go once we open up this space. I poured coffee, nodded at fabric swatches, kept my recorder running in my pocket, kept building the case Daniel would later call one of the more thorough evidentiary files he'd seen from a client who wasn't a lawyer. Friday evening, Ryan talked renovations with an openness he'd never shown before, knocking down the kitchen wall, a wet bar for his college friends. Maybe a place upstate once things are more flexible financially. Flexible how? I asked, light curious. Once the paperwork's finalized, there's more room to make moves. Refinance again down the line, pull some equity for investments. Nothing to worry about. He smiled over his wine glass, and I thought of Walter's camera behind the bookshelf, still quietly telling the truth even when no one wanted it heard. Saturday brought Margaret in full force, rearranging pantry shelves, declaring the fireplace mantel needed replacing with something with real character. Sunday evening gave me the piece of evidence I hadn't known I still needed. Ryan found me washing dishes and wrapped his arms around my waist, kissing the side of my head, murmuring low and warm, thinking he spoke only to a woman who trusted him completely. Once everything's transferred, you won't even have to think about any of this again. You'll just wake up one day and it'll all be handled. You won't even realize how it happened. I just want to protect you from the stress. I kept my hands moving in the soapy water, kept my breathing even. In my cardigan pocket, the recorder caught every word. "That sounds nice," I said softly. Only I knew what those words actually were. A full, unguarded confession from a man so certain of victory he no longer felt any need for caution. Monday morning, I met Daniel one final time in a coffee shop parking lot 3 towns over. Every filing was complete, notice of interest recorded, deed protections in place, documentation ready the moment it was needed. "Are you ready for this evening?" he asked. "I've been ready since the day I watched that video." That evening, I came home to find Ryan setting the table with unusual care, the good plates, the candles from our wedding. A bottle of wine he'd clearly chosen for the occasion. Margaret arrived dressed for celebration. "A little dinner before the signing," Ryan said, pulling out my chair. "You deserve something nice, given how understanding you've been." I sat down at the table my father's money had helped build, across from the two people who'd spent weeks planning to take it from me, and smiled, and raised my glass when Ryan toasted. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes warm. "To new beginnings," I echoed, meaning something entirely different. Neither of them noticed how often I glanced toward the front door, counting the minutes, knowing a car was already on its way to change everything they thought they'd already won. Dinner unfolded exactly as Ryan had planned, candlelight, wine poured generously, Margaret telling a long story about Ryan's childhood, meant to remind me how deeply he belonged to this family. How naturally I should want to belong too. I laughed in the right places, ate very little and no one noticed, too absorbed in their own quiet celebration. When the plates were cleared, Ryan pulled the folder from the sideboard and set it between us, sliding a pen across the tablecloth. "No rush," he said, though his eyes said otherwise. Margaret leaned forward, wine glass forgotten, watching the pen the way you watch the last seconds before a firework goes off. I picked it up. I let it rest in my fingers, feeling the weight of everything the last 2 weeks had asked of me, the silence, the faked smiles. The night spent awake with a recorder in my pocket, and a heart full of grief for the marriage I'd thought I had. I lowered the pen toward the signature line. The doorbell rang. Ryan's head snapped up. "We're not expecting anyone." He glanced at his mother, who shook her head, equally confused. "I'll get it," I said, setting the pen down without signing a single letter. I opened the door to find Daniel Cross standing on the porch in a gray suit, calm and unhurried, a leather folder under his arm. Behind him stood a uniformed court officer holding a small stack of documents. "Good evening, Mrs. Carter," Daniel said, his voice pitched perfectly, professional, unbothered, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted. "I believe this is a good time." I stepped aside and let them in. Ryan rose so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "What is this?" His eyes moved from Daniel to the officer to me, and I watched something behind them begin to shift. The first tremor of a man realizing the ground beneath him was no longer solid. "Emily, what's going on?" I walked back to my seat and sat, folding my hands the way I'd learned in Daniel's office. Calm, deliberate, a woman fully in possession of herself. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," Daniel said, addressing Ryan and Margaret both. "I'm here on behalf of my client to formally notify you that this property has been legally protected against unauthorized transfer, refinancing, or encumbrance. Any documents requiring her signature for such purposes are void as of today, and any future attempt to alter ownership will require independent legal review and her verified, unpressured consent. The court officer placed the documents on the table beside Ryan's folder, one stack representing the future they'd planned, the other quietly dismantling it. Margaret's face had gone pale, her warmth drained, replaced by something colder. "This is absurd. This is our family's home. Ryan has every right. Ryan has whatever rights are granted under the law, and under any agreement Mrs. Carter willingly enters into," Daniel said evenly. "Neither applies here." He reached into his folder and laid out, one by one, the evidence I'd gathered in silence, transcripts of Walter's footage, the refinance clause circled in red, emails between Margaret and the broker, and finally the voice recorder. He pressed play, filling the dining room with Ryan's own voice from the night before. "Once everything's transferred, you won't even have to think about any of this again. You won't even realize how it happened." Ryan's face drained of color. Margaret sat frozen, staring at the recorder like something that had betrayed her personally. "How long have you known?" Ryan asked, his voice stripped of confidence, almost pleading. I looked at him, really looked, searching one last time for some trace of the man who'd held my hand at my father's funeral. "Long enough," I said. The words hung there, simple and final. I watched something in him finally break, not surprise, not even anger. Just the slow understanding of a man who'd been so certain of success that he never considered I might have been watching him just as carefully as he'd been watching me. They left within the hour. Ryan packed 2 suitcases in near silence. Margaret waited by the door, arms crossed, refusing to look at me, until just before stepping outside she turned and said, voice stripped of warmth, "You'll regret this. Family is family, Emily. You'll learn that the hard way, alone in this house." "I already have a family," I said, "the one my father built for me. And this house is part of what he left me, not something I'm willing to hand over to protect people who were never protecting me back." She didn't respond. The door closed behind them, quiet and ordinary, somehow louder than anything else that night. I stood alone in the hallway a long time, listening to the house settle the way it had that first strange night, with Walter's drive heavy in my pocket. I walked slowly through each room, nothing physically changed, and yet it felt like I finally understood what had been true about it all along, that it was mine, fully and completely. In a way it never quite felt before that phone call, before that video, before I learned exactly what I was capable of when everything I loved was threatened. I called Walter the next morning, mostly to thank him again, though I think I really just wanted to hear a kind voice. When I told him how it ended, he was quiet a moment, then said something I've carried with me since. "Houses hold on to the truth longer than people do, Mrs. Carter. I'm just glad this one still had a little truth left to give you. I think about that often. How close I came to signing away everything my father worked his whole life to give me, simply because I trusted the wrong smile at the wrong table. I think about how real love doesn't need secrecy, or paperwork slipped quietly past someone who trusts you too much to read the fine print. I think about how the truest partnership is built in the open, not behind a mother-in-law's furniture catalogs or a husband's practiced reassurances. I still live in that house. I finally put in the tomato garden I always planned, and some mornings I sit on the porch with my coffee, watching the light move across the yard, thinking about how easily I could have lost all of it, not just the walls and windows, but the quiet, hard-won peace of finally trusting my own eyes over anyone else's words. If you were in my position, I'd love to know what you would have done differently or the same. Let me know in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. If this story stayed with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.